The cold night air was tense, the flashing blue and red lights casting eerie shadows across the quiet neighborhood. A black woman in a sleek designer coat stood calmly on the sidewalk, her hands raised, as two officers aggressively questioned her. Their sharp, dismissive tone made it clear they believed they had authority, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Unbeknownst to them, this was no ordinary woman. She was the quiet force behind the very department they worked for, the billionaire philanthropist who had anonymously funded new training programs, state-of-the-art equipment, and even their latest precinct renovations. Her silence wasn't from fear, but from a deep, simmering disbelief at the irony of the moment. As the situation escalated, the truth loomed closer, threatening to flip the entire narrative upside down. What happens when power meets justice? And justice finally gets a voice. Stay tuned. The woman's name was Naomi Blake, though most people only knew her through headlines and whispers in elite circles. As one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country, she had built her fortune in technology and used it to quietly fund causes she believed in: education reform, criminal justice initiatives, and community policing programs. But anonymity had always been her shield. She preferred to work behind the scenes, letting her actions speak louder than her name. Tonight, however, that shield felt paper-thin. Naomi had been visiting an old friend in the neighborhood when a patrol car pulled up. Someone had reported a suspicious person, and now she found herself at the center of a growing scene. The officers didn't ask who she was or why she was there. They assumed. Naomi's heart pounded, not from fear, but from a growing sense of outrage. How far would this go before they realized their mistake? The officers began rifling through Naomi's purse, pulling out her belongings with careless arrogance. She remained silent, watching their every move, her face a mask of calm. But inside, the weight of the moment bore down on her. This wasn't just about her. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something she had been fighting against for years with her money and influence. Across the street, a few neighbors had gathered, some recording the incident on their phones. One older woman shouted, "She's done nothing wrong," but was quickly silenced by the glare of one of the officers. Naomi glanced toward the crowd, her eyes meeting theirs for a brief moment. It was as if they were silently asking her to stand up, to say something. But how could she without making the situation worse? Meanwhile, one officer glanced at Naomi's sleek watch and raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you steal this from?" he sneered. The other laughed under his breath, but Naomi didn't flinch. She knew revealing her identity now might stop this in its tracks, but she wanted them to face the consequences of their assumptions, not her status. The tension crackled like electricity, and the night felt heavier with every passing second. Naomi's patience was wearing thin, but she held her composure. The officers, emboldened by her silence, escalated their search. One began questioning her about where she lived and what she was doing in this part of town, while the other continued rummaging through her belongings. Every word they spoke was laced with presumption, their tone dripping with condescension. They didn't care about answers. They were feeding off their own authority. The crowd across the street had grown. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the small group, their phones now capturing every angle of the unfolding drama. Naomi could feel the eyes of strangers on her, the weight of their unspoken support mixed with their own helplessness. She wondered how many of them had been in her shoes before, caught in a moment like this, feeling both powerless and defiant. Then one of the officers pulled out Naomi's wallet and froze. Inside was a photo of her at a charity gala, shaking hands with the mayor. His partner noticed and leaned over, his brow furrowing as realization began to creep in. But instead of stopping, they exchanged a look, one that suggested they were in too deep to back down now. The tension in the air was suffocating. Naomi could see their discomfort, but said nothing. She wanted them to fully grasp what they had done. As the weight of their actions began to sink in, the crowd grew restless, sensing a breaking point was near. The question hung unspoken in the air. What would they do now? As the officer slid the wallet back into Naomi's purse, his hand trembled slightly. He glanced nervously at his partner, but the second officer was already doubling down, raising his voice as though intimidation could cover their mistake. "You think you're untouchable," he barked. "We don't care who you know. You're not above the law." Naomi's calm exterior cracked just slightly, a sharp breath, a subtle narrowing of her eyes. She stepped forward, just enough to command their attention, and for the first time that night, she spoke. "And what law have I broken?" Her voice was low but steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. The officers hesitated, momentarily thrown off by her poise. But before anyone could respond, the crowd began to stir. A black SUV rolled up to the scene, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing lights. The door swung open, and out stepped a sharply dressed man who exuded authority. It was Charles Peterson, the police chief. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. Why was he here? How did he know? The officers froze, their smug demeanor evaporating as Charles approached. His piercing gaze shifted from Naomi to the two men, who now looked like they wanted to disappear. Naomi remained still, her expression unreadable, as the chief turned to her and said, "Miss Blake, I'm sorry this happened." For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The officers looked at each other in panic, and the crowd waited with bated breath. But Naomi didn't reply. Instead, she crossed her arms and simply stared at the two men, her silence speaking volumes. The night wasn't over yet, and the reckoning had only just begun. The crowd fell silent as Charles Peterson turned to the officers, his expression hardening. "Do you even realize who you've been harassing?" he demanded. The two men stammered, their confidence shattered. One of them tried to offer a weak excuse, but Charles cut him off sharply. "Enough. Your actions tonight are not just unprofessional. They're a disgrace." Naomi finally broke her silence. "I could have told you who I was," she said calmly, her voice steady. "But I wanted you to see yourselves for what you've become. You didn't see a person, you saw a target. And that's exactly what I've been fighting to change." The weight of her words sank in, but before anyone could respond, Naomi reached into her purse and handed Charles a folder. Inside were detailed reports, complaints, incidents, patterns of behavior involving these same officers. Her philanthropy hadn't just been about funding. She'd been quietly investigating, collecting evidence, preparing for this very moment. Charles opened the folder, his face darkening as he flipped through the pages. The officers' panic was palpable now, their bravado completely gone. "Effective immediately, you're both suspended," he said, his voice cold and firm. But Naomi wasn't done. Turning to the crowd, she raised her voice. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been ignored, mistreated, or judged unfairly. Change starts here, and it starts tonight." As applause broke out, one of the officers, red-faced and desperate, blurted out, "You can't ruin our lives over this." Naomi looked at him, her expression unflinching. "You did that yourself." The SUV door opened again, revealing Naomi's legal team stepping out. "We have everything we need," one of them said quietly. Naomi nodded, turning back to Charles. "Let's ensure this never happens again." The night ended with the officers quietly escorted away, their badges temporarily stripped as an internal investigation began. The crowd slowly dispersed, some still buzzing with disbelief, others nodding with a sense of justice finally served. Naomi sat in the back seat of her car, the weight of the evening settling over her. She had made her point, but she knew this was just one battle in a much larger fight. As the SUV drove away, Naomi glanced out the window at the community she'd been working so hard to protect. This moment wasn't about her power or her wealth. It was about using what she had to shine a light on injustice. Change wasn't just a single event, it was a relentless commitment to action. By morning, the story was everywhere, sparking conversations far beyond the neighborhood. And for Naomi, it was a reminder that sometimes the quietest voices can make the loudest impact. As the crowd erupted with cheers and calls for accountability, Naomi walked to her car. But before getting in, she paused and looked back. The officers stood there, frozen, realizing the full weight of what had just happened. Naomi didn't need to say another word. Justice had finally arrived, and it was just the beginning.